Welcome to our last session of these hybrid philosophy video lectures for Philosophy 101. Our job tonight is to talk more about Nietzsche and specifically the part two of the reading selections from the gay science that I put together for you guys. So, like I mentioned in class this morning, I don't have too much of an agenda here in terms of what I want to be lecturing on. And I was hoping that those of you who are in the chat here with me tonight would have some suggestions for aphorisms to take a look at. In the absence of that, I will pick some. But if you guys have some stuff you want to talk about, then I like to follow where your interest leads, because there's way more than we're going to be able to really deconstruct here in an hour. So, and I'm not going to try to do like a super long section or something like that. We're not going to do this systematically. Also, if there's leftover stuff from part one that you want to talk about, I'm definitely game for that too. I was looking over it over the weekend and being like, oh yeah, there's that and this that we never talked about. So for those of you in the chat, just let any suggestions fly. And well, let me check and see. Do you guys have anything ready to go? Any particular things you would like to talk about? Yeah, okay, the single sentences. Yeah, let's bring those up. And actually, let me pull them into the video chat here, too. I can do that. Those of you who are with me live will have to pull it up on your own, but those of you on YouTube can follow along with me here. Yes, we're definitely going to do that one, Ayaka. That's a good call. Thank you for bringing that one up. That's a good one to talk about. Yeah, and just drop them into the chat right now, and we'll just go with them in order as much as we can. That's my plan. I'd love to have a queue lined up if that's possible. Okay, so Lawrence, were there any particular ones from these single sentences that you wanted to talk about? And yeah, Rob, we'll do that last one. All of them? Okay. So let's start here with 267. I think we could probably go through a bunch of these. Definitely possible. And I can share with you guys kind of what I think about these. There's a lot of interpretation that's involved with Nietzsche. I think I've mentioned this a couple times, but there's a lot of dispute about how to read him. I've been saying that you got to read him very carefully, and so I try to read him very carefully and bring in like everything that I know about all of his other writings and trying to compare, do this textual exegesis to try to get it right. So I got some things I can share, some thoughts on what's going on with these little one-liners, but I'm curious what you would think about them too, and maybe your interpretations are different than mine. We can talk about that a little bit too. Nietzsche, working out Nietzsche is a process, definitely a process. Okay, so this first one says, with a great goal, one is superior even to justice, not only to one's deeds and judges. I think this aphorism is mainly highlighting Nietzsche's kind of rejection of conventional morality, the kind of classic intuitive sense of morality that we have. I think Nietzsche is saying we got to bust up that old stuff and make room for something new. And that kind of great project is something that is this whole gay science thing that Nietzsche's interested in, the like revaluation of values, or the experimentation with human life and how it might be structured by principles that aren't the ones that are given to us from those instinctual inheritances from our evolutionary development. I think that's Nietzsche's main point here, is that kind of thing. This also kind of connects back with the things that we were talking about this morning in class about how Nietzsche is not for a kind of amoralism, because he says you can be superior to justice, aka morality, but only with a great goal. So there's some kind of other measuring stick here for how to value things that Nietzsche's implying. And this is one of the things that he gets really cagey about, that I'm always frustrated with him on. That I want him to be a little more specific about it, but he's kind of allergic to direct rational proof, it seems like at times. So that's what I think's going on there. And feel free to drop in questions here as I'm talking through this stuff. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. So definitely let me know if there's more you want to talk about with these. Um, this heroicism thing on the next aphorism, what makes one heroic? To approach at the same time one's greatest suffering and one's highest hope. This is there's some interesting things to say about this. Nietzsche is a big fan of the whole hero thing, of what kind of visions we have of heroicism and what counts as greatness of purpose and this sort of thing. Like I told you guys that Nietzsche is he's a classicist by trade. He is an ancient philosopher. He mostly his most of his early philosophical education in his career was centered around studying ancient Greek philosophy. And the Greeks are really keen on this sort of like greatness and honor and kind of glory stuff. But like realizing the highest excellences of humanity. And I think Nietzsche definitely is in line with that sort of thing. He does have a kind of, the Greek word here is eudaimonia, which is sometimes translated as happiness, but it's not really about what we might associate with that word. It's not so much about a state of satisfaction or contentment or pleasure or something like that. It's more like, my favorite definition of eudaimonia that I've heard from contemporary scholarship is if you are eudaimon, if you are the happy person, if you're eudaimon, then you're an example of human life at its very best. So you're like it's kind of like what we use the word awesome for. You're like, you're an awesome human being. Like, good job. Like, you nailed this whole being human thing. That's what being eudaimon is about. And a lot of the themes that we see here in the gay science are very much about that kind of what can humanity be? What can it become that it isn't already? What other kinds of excellences are possible here? I think that's part of what's going on there. This whole thing about highest fears and greatest hopes, or greatest fears, highest hopes, something like that, I think has to do with the um, that theme of like overcoming that strong people do, the way in which, at least as Nietzsche describes it, that your hope is like what drives you to do something and to or to like make a kind of change, and the fears can come from like all the parts of you that rebel against that. So, for instance, if we're going to do this project that Nietzsche is encouraging us to have happen, where we are kind of leaving the land behind and entering out onto that ocean of the infinite, of all these other possibilities of how we might be, that we can't take for granted the things that are intuitive to us, then that's kind of like that's a very fearful position to be in. I think that's exactly how Nietzsche describes it. He's like here in the first aphorism we read today. Um, but there will be hours when you realize that it is infinite and there is nothing more awesome than infinity. So it's not always silk and gold and dreams of goodness, but there's kind of a threat here to really have that kind of ambition and to pursue that highest hope. Um, that might be, it might require the kind of suffering of um, constraining your nature in a way that it doesn't want to be constrained. That causes a kind of suffering, but that also has a kind of heroism to it, that you're fighting to overcome yourself. That's a big Nietzschean theme. Shall I keep going? Lawrence, you want to do some more of these? How are you guys doing with this? So far, so good? Yeah? Okay. Um, this whole conscience bit. Um, what does your conscience say? You should become who you are. I think I talked about this one this morning, right? I might be mixing things up with my other 8:30 class. Did we talk about this one? I've got some memory flashbacks here. Yeah, okay. Okay, sweet. So I won't belabor it too much. I think definitely the point here is not necessarily a positive one. It's not necessarily something that Nietzsche is like recommending to us. I think it is in some ways kind of like a warning. It's like this is what the conscience is going to say to you. But there's another question here. There's another way in which we could understand the aphorism that I didn't mention this morning, which has to do with the other instance in which Nietzsche uses the word conscience. He also talks about it as an intellectual conscience, right? This conscience for your conscience. So he could be referring to the conscience that he actually does recommend, this so-called intellectual conscience. Um, Jocelyn, I just want to let you know that you're in the shot, so don't walk around. Sorry about that. Um, and there's another instance in which Nietzsche uses conscience way at the end. So at the very last aphorism here, Nietzsche says at the very end of it, we, however, oh wait, yeah. So he says we should. It's yes, my friends. He's saying yes, my friends, come here. It's time to feel nauseous about some people's moral chatter about others. Sitting in moral judgment um, should offend our taste. Let us leave such chatter and bad taste to those who have nothing to do but drag the past a few steps further through time and who never live in the present. That is, to the many, the great majority. We, however, want to become who we are, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. Okay, now that's the other instance of this language of becoming who you are, sort of thing. And this is a little different meaning. So it's not just this idea of the conscience kind of reporting on the program that is already in motion and just kind of sending out that kind of propaganda again, if you want to use my little model that I keep drawing up here of the drives that they project out these rational judgments and messages. I think the other way that this aphorism could be read is to say that uh, Nietzsche's conscience tells him to create himself. And the who you are, in the way that he talks about it in that last aphorism that I was just quoting, is more about like making yourself into what you are rather than having that determined for you by, say, the instincts or drives that you've inherited. I think if there's going to be any message to it, it's got to be that one. If there's any positive message to it, it's got to be something like that. Nietzsche's not going to say like follow your conscience. Like that's the kind of thing he's complaining about in that last aphorism that we read last week when we first started Nietzsche, which we'll probably come back to at some point tonight. Yeah, so that Rob, what you're talking about is like the tension here. On the one hand, if he's talking about conscience in terms of the way he's complaining about it at the beginning of the last aphorism, then and the way that he just talks about what is our conscience today, it's the product of all this prehistory of drives. Then that's not going to be something that Nietzsche's going to say, oh, just do what that says. But at the same time, he does talk about becoming who we are as a part of this process of developing ourselves in some new way. It's a little weird. I think there's some, it touches a little bit on here with Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence, where the strong people are like creating themselves over the multitude of overlapping infinite universes that are always identical to each other, stuff like that. Like a weird way of it's almost like a destiny concept. Like strong people believe in themselves as being something more, that they are going to be a part of this overcoming and turning into something bigger. But that's about as much as I want to say about that, because this is where it starts getting a little weird and maybe not useful to us. Okay, let's see what else we got here from these. Oh yeah, these ones are great. Where lies your greatest dangers? In compassion, he says. And that's supposed to just be another like slap in the face of conventional morality. I think Nietzsche thinks that compassion, which is a major part of what he identifies as conventional morality or slave morality, this morality of weak people, is compassion is really just motivating a limitation on yourself. It's like restraining yourself, being concerned about other people, and not just trying to pursue your like best version of yourself or something like that. Nietzsche definitely as a kind of embraces selfishness. Um, the whole idea of compassion here is like the strong people need to have compassion on the weak people rather than just doing their strong thing, and that's the thing that Nietzsche's like, no, the strong people shouldn't be shackled down by this whole compassion thing. That compassion is a drive in you. that will kind of weigh down or pull on your more ambitious drives that are trying to do something greater. Um, I think that to just kind of put in my 2 cents on this. So here's my 2 cents. This is one of the biggest points of disagreement between me and Nietzsche. Just again for the record, I didn't assign Nietzsche because I think he's right about everything, and I actually disagree with a lot of what he has to say. Even though I think he has a lot of useful insight, very deep insights that sometimes I haven't really heard anywhere else other than Nietzsche. But this is one of the points that I take great issue with him. That Nietzsche thinks of compassion as a kind of weakness rather than as a kind of power. And if Nietzsche really is, he is all about will to power, and I might be even willing to like go along with him to a certain extent on this. Of like, there's something to needing to have more powerful paradigms from which we understand the meaning of life, and to not be held down by some of the patterns that we have developed that are kind of counterproductive to that. But I see love and compassion as really the um, core of what strength is going to be about. And actually, there are some aphorisms from this reading that I think Nietzsche has some kind of like I've got my foot in the door with him because of some of the other things that he says. Um, so I will. Maybe we'll hang on to that for when we go to what you want to talk about, Ayaka, about the love section. So we'll have to get to that too. Okay, back at it. What do you love in others? Nietzsche says, my hopes. He doesn't. He wants something greater for them. Remember, whether he's being cagey about this or not, like how authentic. This is Nietzsche's happy period. And there's an aphorism that it might be cool to look at that happens a little bit later, where he says, I want to be a yes sayer. I don't even want to be a naysayer to the naysayers. I want to be only a yes sayer. So this is the part where I think Nietzsche still is kind of, he's a little torn about it. He's a little still on the fence. He hasn't gone full cynic yet. And maybe this part of like his frustration with most of humanity, still he has that kind of hope for them at this stage of his life, but that will die in a couple books later after Gay Science. So there's that. Whom do you call bad? Oh, the next two we should put together. Whom do you call bad? He who always wants to put people to shame. What is most human to you? To spare someone shame. And what's the seal of having become free? No longer to be ashamed before oneself. These are some really deep windows into Nietzsche's thinking. That there's something about this shame stuff that I think is connected with Nietzsche's concern about this attitude of resentment that I've talked to you guys about before. This kind of resentment that weak people have to strong people, and by extension to any forces in the world that constrain them, this sort of thing. And that kind of stuff, the idea of there being some kind of externally imposed standards that you fail to meet up with, and that causes this kind of shame that makes you dissatisfied with life, and that might make you bitter toward it or resentful to it or to hate it eventually, and to then hate oneself. Nietzsche sees this as like the death of the human spirit, and I think there's something to this. I think Nietzsche sometimes goes okay, well now I'm doing this. I think Nietzsche sometimes goes a little far here in thinking that shame always has this kind of negative aspect on us, and he kind of, or well, to put it this way, that to get rid of the shame, you get rid of the moral standards. So you don't talk about there being any kind of good or bad or something like that, or any kind of standards of what's ideal or more ideal. Obviously, Nietzsche still got some of those standards about what's ideal for humanity and what's not. He's definitely using that. And I always think it's kind of ironic that he puts these aphorisms in there, because in my experience of teaching Nietzsche for, gosh, 6 years now, going on 7 years, I'd say the number one reaction that I get from students about Nietzsche, this isn't always true, it's not a universal reaction, but it's definitely a very common reaction, is that they're kind of like, Nietzsche's a jerk because he makes me feel bad about myself. Like, the kinds of demands that he puts on humanity and the way that he's like calling out all of us for being so bullshitty. I mean, it's pretty aggressive, and it's kind of, you can definitely get a shame reaction out of it. So I think it's kind of ironic that he puts it in there. I don't think that he's saying this at all in a tongue-in-cheek way. I think he's absolutely sincere here, that he sees this emotional attitude of shame as something that stifles the human spirit. Um, yeah, but maybe this is the last thing I'll say about this, is that Nietzsche thinks shame is something else that a human being has to overcome, perhaps, and that's another thing that might make the strong person is they don't participate in that. But still, this might also be getting into a little bit of compassion that maybe Nietzsche doesn't want to endorse. So some interesting things there to kind of kick around. Those aphorisms are ones that I consider as like the spice that when I'm like interpreting other passages, I have to remember, oh yeah, Nietzsche said that shit about shame. Maybe that has something to like nuance what's happening in something else that he's talking about. So it's good to keep that in mind. All right, I think that's all of the one-liners. Let's see, let me go back in the chat here. Oh yeah, let's do love next. That's the next thing. Let's do that. Okay, here. So the love aphorism. Yeah, here we go. 334. That's the one that you're talking about, right, Ayaka? The one must learn to love? Yeah. Okay. And by the way, Rob, you're right. If I remember right, when you're talking about the shackles on the strong, things like compassion, that's the shackles. Yeah, you're right. If that's what you're going for. Okay, let's take a look at this love passage. One must learn to love. This happens to us in music. First, one must learn to hear a figure and melody at all, to detect and distinguish it, to isolate and delimit it as a life in itself. Then one needs effort and goodwill to stand it, despite its strangeness, patience with its appearance and expression, and kind-heartedness about its oddity. Finally comes a moment when we're used to it, when we expect it, when we sense that we'd miss it if it were missing. And now it continues relentlessly to compel and enchant us until we have become its humble and enraptured lovers who no longer want anything better from the world than it and it again. Um, Actually, my little story here. My fiance's in the other room. My fiance, when she gets a hold of a song that she likes, she listens to it on repeat forever and just kills it dead. And I always think of her when I read this aphorism from Nietzsche. The other little anecdote that this passage reminds me of, for those of you who are in the chat, I think it was the last one that we had, and I was playing that really weird, wacky music. There's that song that is like constantly like a CD skipping, and it doesn't let you get back on the rhythm of like a flow. It's like constantly frustrating you on that. That's another thing. That kind of music is what I think about when Nietzsche's saying this, and I love that music now. And from an objective point of view, it's like unlistenable. It's like totally confounds the standards of what we consider aesthetically pleasing. But as I listen to it like over and over and over, and I just stand it, then I've like really grown to like love that kind of music and what it has to offer. So Nietzsche's talking about a kind of process here, that this happens for everything, that we have to learn to love things, that love is not a spontaneous reaction from our instincts. It's something that has to be cultivated, and that fits a lot with what Nietzsche was saying about self-cultivation of our characters, that what's good is not these wild, untamed instincts that spring up in us spontaneously. Nietzsche is totally against anything that would say that natural reactions are more authentic or more sincere or something like that. He thinks everything has to be constructed. And whether it's worthy or not as an object of love is a different matter entirely than whether it had to be created or not. I like this thing that he says a little bit later in the aphorism. We are always rewarded in the end for our goodwill, our patience, our fair-mindedness, and gentleness with what is strange, as it gradually casts off its veil and presents itself as a new and indescribable beauty. That is its thanks for our hospitality. Even he who loves himself will have learned it this way. There is no other way. Love too must be learned. Um, so there's a kind of way in which we have to learn to stand ourselves in all of our strangeness, in all of our potential counter intuitiveness, or how we don't match up with expectations, or even the things that we might say are ugly about us. Nietzsche thinks all of that stuff has to be given some room before it can be affirmed and accepted. And I think Nietzsche thinks of a strong person in this kind of way, that they work on that, but they're not. It's not so much like um, a complete acceptance of everything that's going on, to just be like, oh, that's what it is, and therefore, accepting it, sort of thing. I think there's some tension here in Nietzsche about this saying yes to everything sort of thing, and the careful cultivation of something, of being like uh, self-disciplined, even if it, like Nietzsche, is not really imposing at the outset any kind of real objective standards for how that should look, but just that kind of activity, that kind of process. Those are the drives that Nietzsche seems to be emphasizing as ideal for humanity. The cultivation of being able to see things as beautiful is something that the strong people can do. That's another part of what Nietzsche's got going on. I'm really tempted to go to another aphorism right now that's related. Do you guys have any questions or comments here at this point, though? I really want to hear what you guys think about Nietzsche too along the way here. Feel free to interrupt. Unashamed understanding of oneself instead of blind acceptance. There might be something to that. When I imagine um, the kind of process that the person who's cultivating themselves as an art form is going to go through, according to Nietzsche, by the strong, like what the strong person might do, it probably is going to be like a recognition of those aspects of the character that are weak, or are unideal, or have problems with them, and either working them in a way where they can become part of something beautiful, or sometimes being afraid to just cut them, but not with this kind of attitude of shame, not being like, ugh, there's this terrible thing in me, I gotta get rid of it because it's totally wrong or something. I think Nietzsche wouldn't be about that. I don't think he would approve of that kind of attitude. Um, so yeah, Lawrence is asking, what is he defining as love? I think you get a good sense from this aphorism that Nietzsche is saying something that is loved is something that we develop a drive for, that we develop a kind of a drive that's going to seek that thing out, that treats it as valuable by how big that drive has gotten. Nietzsche talks at the end about how, at the highest extent of the evolution of love, there's this kind of treating the object of love as a condition of life. And that's exactly the story that we got from the cultivation of drives in the history of humanity. That once a drive got really strongly embedded in our natures, now we just see it as a condition for life. We're like, I can't imagine life without this thing. Why are you supposed to tell me I'm not supposed to have this thing going on? That's what made it hard for truth to get its foot in the door and take hold in us. That's why it took a long process for that, because the truth-seeking drive was basically going against the drives that we had since considered as kind of the conditions for life. So that's what I think Nietzsche has in mind here by love. Maybe also, I mean, what's the other language he uses here? This kind of uh, expecting it, missing it when it's gone, a kind of a attachment to it almost. Um, the way in which it brings us these feelings of like of recognizing its beauty, the indescribable beauty, that kind of stuff. I think that's also part of what Nietzsche would talk about as love. Um, I don't know if Nietzsche is going to use a concept of like care, which is, to be perfectly honest, that's how I want to talk about love. And I think it involves care at some point. I don't think Nietzsche is going to talk about it in that sense. So that might be another point of disagreement. Um, Daniel, you say you haven't felt compelled to question him at all because you just don't buy what he's selling. So you're like, I don't even need to refute him because I'm not really like drawn to engaging with him at all? I see him questioning more of the social construct of reality. It seems like this whole topic is definable sociologically, not philosophically. I think this is an important point to make and something to put into context here. Um, remember when Nagel is complaining about relativistic uh, reductions and explaining away of the claims that we make about what is true? Nietzsche is one of the guys that he has in mind. There's a couple of turns of phrases that Nagel uses that are like explicit to Nietzsche sort of things. Um, and I think that's something that has to be addressed here. How much is Nietzsche just talking about sociology instead of philosophy? But here's where I think Nietzsche gets some kind of traction here that's a little different than just a relativistic type of response or objection or reduction. Um, Nietzsche is saying that the that what's really fundamental about humanity is not our rational capacities, it's our drives. And if he's right about that, that's a pretty big point here about how we'd have to approach doing philosophy. That if we wanted to get at the truth, we've got to engage with drives, not the propaganda messages that they give off. But I do think so. I think that gives him some traction for doing something different. But then I do think, to a certain extent, Nagel can come right back and say, all right, Nietzsche, then what are we supposed to do that's different? How are we supposed to engage in this gay science study that you want us to do? Okay, fine. Let's experiment with other ways of being human. No problem with that. But how are we going to discriminate between which one of those are ideal and which ones are not ideal? You're going to have to at some point rely on some kind of principles to justify that. I think Nietzsche's kind of cagey on this in terms of giving a response. And I think that's a weak point in his philosophy. And that's why I have a hard time taking it whole hog, too. At the same time, I think even with a realist perspective, there, from a realist point of view, you can take seriously what Nietzsche has to say about human beings being drives. That might be what we're dealing with here. That's what we're working with, and we shouldn't expect that a rational argument is necessarily going to cause any kind of real changes in humanity without addressing the underlying drives behind the philosophical positions that we're disagreeing with. We have to have more sensitivity to the motive, and that's what I see. Williams, when he's responding to Nagel, is kind of arguing for something like that too. And like Rob pointed out before our lecture got started tonight, guess who did the translation of the gay science that we're reading? Bernard Williams. So I think Williams has a kind of Nietzschean influence in there too. Um, have you seen cases of feral children or people raised in extreme isolation? They have none of these concepts or drives. They are biological, right? Seems like defining how to go about this study would be a lost cause as social constructs and importance given to objects or symbols shifts. Well, the feral children thing is not something that really threatens Nietzsche's position as a counterexample because Nietzsche's talking about these instincts as something that has been driven forward not just through our biological history, like the kind of evolution that Nietzsche's talking about is not just genetic, but it's also cultural and sociological. It's like the development of human civilization. Um, I don't know if I was talking to you guys about memes. I think that was something I was bringing up with my 8:30 class. But that's a way that we can sensibly talk about evolutionary dynamics without talking about genetics, and I think that's how Nietzsche's using it too. I'm sure he's happy to bring in some genetics a little bit, but he's definitely not going to restrict it to just that. The evolution of morality and the drives that got connected with it, that's not something biological. So I don't think Nietzsche could in any way stick to just that. I think he's automatically drawn into this other stuff. Um, okay, here's a other aphorism that was connected with the love aphorism. Let me find it. Um, no, that's not it. Uh, no, that's not it. No. Yeah, I think I wanted. I'm losing my train of thought. But I think I wanted to go with this one. Um, the for the new year, Aphorism 276. If you guys are following along, and this is just about the like affirmation side of Nietzsche. I think I think this is the one I was thinking of. Okay, so he says for the new year, um, blah 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 blah. Some reference to Descartes that doesn't matter so much, I think. Um, Today, like New Year's, everyone allows himself to express his dearest wish and thoughts, like your New Year's resolutions. So I too want to say what I wish from myself today, and what thought first crossed my heart. What thought shall be the reason, warrant, and sweetness of the rest of my life? Like, in other words, what kind of drive does Nietzsche want to put at the center here? What does he want to build human life around? If it's not going to be these other kinds of drives that we've inherited and we've been kicking around for a long time, what's it going to be? He says, I want to learn more and more how to see what is necessary in things as what is beautiful in them. Thus I'll be one of those who makes things beautiful. Amor fati. Let that be my love from now on. Love of fate. Amor fati is love of fate. I do not want to wage war against ugliness. I do not want to accuse. I do not want to accuse the accusers. Let looking away be my only negation. And all in all, and on the whole, some day I want only to be a yes-sayer. So I think that kind of connects with what Nietzsche's talking about with love, in the sense that Nietzsche, in some way, believes that at some kind of fundamental level, everything is capable of being like acknowledged as beautiful, as having grounds for being affirmed. And these aphorisms are some of the reasons why I talk about this as Nietzsche's happy period, because affirming everything is not really Nietzsche's general direction in definitely his later works, and he even struggles with it here. I mean, if you after reading everything that happened in part one, I'm not sure you would think, oh yeah, Nietzsche wants to affirm everything. Like that's his game. That's the game he's playing. Like it's not really obvious that this is what he's up to. But I wonder if I don't know. This is where Nietzsche interpretation gets dicey, and for me, I do think of this aphorism as a little bit of a glimpse into a kind of vulnerable side of Nietzsche that he doesn't open up very often. It's very rare that Nietzsche talks about what he's for or what he does affirm. So much of his philosophy is critical of other things. So when he does come out like this, I definitely stop and take note about what he's saying here. Remember the whole ideal that Nietzsche has about the Übermensch, this like next evolution of humanity, the evolution of the strong person. It's all about overcoming. And a big part of that is about this kind of affirmative yes saying, that Nietzsche thinks that part of what is the kind of weak spirit of the weak part of humanity is a no saying, of saying like, no, things can't be like this, that there's a rejection of life. I mean, he's got a lot of things to say about life rejection, which he sees happening a lot in different religious traditions, East and West. A lot of different versions of morality are like treating things as bad and evil, and in some way Nietzsche wants to kind of get past that. He wants to be doing some overcoming, but at the same time, there's a lot of criticism that's apart with creating this kind of vision. So I think Nietzsche isn't necessarily a fully consistent person, and I think that's important when reading him. I think we should try to use as much charity as possible to try to make him consistent. But at one level, I'd say Nietzsche's heading out into uncharted waters in many ways. He's going off the beaten path when it comes to thinking about ethics and what is good for human life. So it stands to reason that the attempts that he makes at this stuff might not always be completely consistent. And so we have to look at like, okay, what's Nietzsche being sensitive to that's like good and accurate, and what part of it is not accurate, or what is missing the mark, or where there's a kind of inconsistency here where Nietzsche is going to have to make some judgment call, and he can't have his cake and eat it too, and that sort of stuff. So I think it's good food for thought. I've always been drawn to this always being a yes sayer thing. I wonder what you guys think of that. And thinking about if no saying is justified, a no saying has to be justified on the grounds that it enables a bigger yes saying. That's a principle that I've thought of. I should have put the hat backwards. Sorry. to try to maybe fix Nietzsche on this point. Um, I can't remember what I was talking about, Ayaka, when you mentioned your comment here about ugliness. Um, maybe you can refresh my memory on that. Rob saying this seems to make him very human, his own internal consistency. Do you mean inconsistency? His criticism, yet his hope not to be critical all the time. Yeah, I interpret Nietzsche as a tortured soul. That's my reading of Nietzsche. Not everyone sees him this way, or thinks of him as having this kind of tension in him. I see it really prominently through some of his other works too, like in what some consider to be his like masterpiece, and what he kind of also thinks of as kind of his masterpiece. Thus Spake Zarathustra. Nietzsche is doing this kind of uh, like Nietzsche version of the Bible. He's like writing a Bible for Nietzsche philosophy. So it's all done in allegory and storytelling, like the Bible does. And the main figure, Zarathustra, is kind of like this John the Baptist figure, someone who is like a prophet that's foretelling the coming of the Übermensch, which is like Jesus kind of thing. And Nietzsche, I think, most strongly identifies with Zarathustra. And the Zarathustra character is himself not uh, the it is not um, the Übermensch himself. He can't do what the Übermensch will be. He can't turn into the Übermensch or something like that. But he's all about being overcome. And I think in some ways Nietzsche interprets the parts of him that are kind of this tortured part of him, like the part of him that can't really fully embrace what the Übermensch means, or something like that, as maybe being the part of him that needs to die, the part of him that needs to be overcome by someone greater than him, or something like that. And I'm not sure if that is the right interpretation Nietzsche should have about his conflicting feelings about things and his conflicting drives, but yeah. Um, oh, the ugliness from the New Year part. Okay, let's go back there, Ayaka. When he says, "I don't want to wage war against ugliness," yeah. Um, so I don't think that Nietzsche is talking about the ugliness of love, like that there is an ugly part of love. At least not in the sense of being the person who's capable of seeing this love in everything, the fundamental yes sayer. I remember Nietzsche talks about the ugliness of someone who's dissatisfied with themselves, or kind of like that is caught in the shame trap, that sees themselves as ugly or has a gloomy mood, Nietzsche says, which I think is always hilarious because Nietzsche's like full of gloominess all the time. Um, but I think he's talking about that. I think he's talking about rejecting that. So when people are like naysayers to stuff and they're being like if you go on YouTube, just go on YouTube and look at some video that's got any kind of controversial content in it, and then you look at all of the posts that are in the comments below and the kinds of discussions that people get into. I mean, it's kind of revolting at times. It's just like the pettiness of people, or the ignorance that's present, or their lack of compassion, their lack of love, the absence of love is kind of maybe repulsive. And I think that's the kind of stuff that Nietzsche's talking about when he's saying like, I don't want to even say I don't want to be a naysayer to the naysayers. He's like, I'm not going to feed the troll. I'm not going to go on there and like take people to task for how stupid they're being. I'm just going to be like, ignore ignore those people. I'm just not going to get wrapped up in that kind of mud flinging game. I think that's what Nietzsche's kind of talking about there, about the ugliness. It's the human spirit ugliness stuff. And what Nietzsche would associate with weak people. The kind of the remember Nietzsche's kind of conception of this weak person is the one who's like always trying to, basically, they're so frustrated with life that they're always trying to revenge themselves upon the world for the frustration that they feel. That kind of ugly human spirit is what I think Nietzsche has in mind. we don't have to mean what Nietzsche means too. That's always an option. I encourage you guys to read Nietzsche, try to listen to him for what he's got to say, but then you don't have to respect him. Take like plunder him for whatever you can get out of him that's true and good and beautiful and great. You know, like go and do that. You don't always have to. There, I I sometimes get frustrated with the overemphasis on scholarship sometimes because at the end of the day, what we're here to do in philosophy is not to necessarily figure out what Nietzsche thought, but to figure out what's really true. And Nietzsche is so difficult to interpret that getting him exactly right is hard. It's worth doing. I mean, you got to listen to the guy to try to figure out what he's saying, but then you can take his ideas and remove them from the context in which Nietzsche puts them. That's totally fair. That's fair for all philosophers. Um, yeah, so Lauren's saying most of those people are being selfish in their own way, though. They lash out against people with ideas contrary to their own. I mean, I think that's what Nietzsche would agree with. He's like, that's exactly what's going on. And it also comes from their own hatred of themselves, that they're not reconciled with themselves, too. That they've internalized these kinds of shame blame games and stuff like that. Yeah, and then Rob says, "Yeah, he's one of the biggest poo flinging monkeys in the fight." Yeah, and that's that kind of inner hypocrisy with Nietzsche. You just have to be like, "Yeah, that's right," but you might still have a point. Hypocrites can still have good points, and that's why the "you do it too" response is something we call a fallacy. We call it the two wrongs fallacy, and it's not good reasoning because even a hypocrite can have an argument that is correct. So what should we do instead? Maybe be yes sayers, something like that. Here's another thing I just have to speak to. So time out here. I have to talk about this. Remember how I said earlier that there's this kind of response to Nietzsche that can just you can feel shamed by Nietzsche, and I think that that's true. I think there's a kind of um, coldness to Nietzsche for all of his talk about wanting to embrace things and to find love in them and to affirm them and this sort of thing. Nietzsche is not very affirming of the aspects of us that do participate in these kinds of struggles. I think that um, not just weak people or something. I think all human beings have have to struggle with overcoming things like self-doubt and negative self-talk. What I sometimes talk about with my fiance is like the demons in your head that do have patterns of self-abuse and stuff like that. And Nietzsche doesn't offer a whole lot of compassion for people who are in that. He's just like, that's bad. Like you should be strong enough to overcome that crap. And I think that that's deeply insensitive. And I just need to go down on the record about that. I think for whatever is good that we can take out of Nietzsche, that is definitely not a part of it. I think this is a big oversight in Nietzsche, and one of the reasons why I think uh, compassion is really the strongest form of love and requires the most strength. It's not the kind of weakness here, but to be able to affirm what's going on, even in those kinds of human struggles that we have, that takes more than what Nietzsche has to offer. I definitely think that. I think the philosophical program that Nietzsche's offering, as compelling and powerful as it may possibly be, falls short of that mark. And that's not a reason to ignore it completely, because there's other parts of the puzzle that he might be doing fairly well, or that maybe could be recovered. But this is definitely a blind spot that I like to call him out for. And so if you were feeling that way about it, if you were reading Nietzsche and being like, man, there's nothing for me here. This guy doesn't speak to what is. I don't think he really understands the experience of people who are struggling with those kinds of things, and doesn't give us anything to work with that. I want to say, I hear you on that. I think you've got a real strong point there in challenging Nietzsche on those grounds. So I wanted to say that. Rob says Nietzsche seems to be the biggest example of his own idea of weak people, and I see a certain sadness around him as he recognizes it, hates it within himself, but doesn't have the capacity to overcome his own drives. To a certain extent, I sympathize with that reading of Nietzsche, but I also think that Nietzsche is maybe has a little more strength than that. That might be too quick of writing him off in that sort of way. We might be neutering him a little bit too much. I do think that he's in deep conflict with himself about this. I'm not sure. I always go back and forth on whether um, Nietzsche is like poisoned with that kind of ressentiment drive that he condemns so much. Um, but definitely, I think there's something to the suggestion that you're offering here. I think we have to be careful about it. We have to be careful about reading into him. I mean, but like I said, I kind of have a reading that's very similar to this too. So I just take my burden of proof as well. I hold that kind of interpretation of Nietzsche carefully, and I try to read him in a way that he might controvert my expectations or interpretation of his character. But I definitely think there's something to that. Okay, let's see. Is there anything else backed up in our queue from the chat here? Do you guys have other aphorisms you're interested in looking at? I love your little screen cap here, Daniel. That's nice. Love it. That's great. Oh no, how do I get back to? There we go. Okay, it was back to me. Oh, the last aphorism. Yeah, yeah. Let's go there. Anything else that you guys have been wanting to talk about? I just kind of want to see where you guys are at with things generally. We'll definitely do the last aphorism. Definitely want to do it. I want to look back on it after all the stuff that we've done. But any other kind of like burning things about Nietzsche that you guys want to talk about? Oh yeah, that's a great one. Oh yeah, we should do that one. Oh man. Okay. Well, this might take us a little bit over an hour, but um, okay, Rob. Yeah, we should do Will and Wave. Oh man, this one's really this is Nietzsche at his like most mysterious. All right. The right context here for interpreting Will and Wave, I think I can just say after all the stuff we've talked about with Nietzsche in class, the key here is Nietzsche is talking about drives. That's the big thing that we're talking about here. Okay. God, I love this one. Yeah, I think this one's beautiful. Will and Wave. How greedily this wave is approaching, as if it were trying to reach something. How it crawls with terrifying haste into the inmost crevices of the craggy gorge. It seems to be trying to arrive before someone else. Something of value, of great value, seems to be hidden there. And now it is returning, a bit more slowly, but still quite white with excitement. Is it disappointed? Has it found what it was seeking? Is it simulating disappointment? But already another wave is nearing, still more greedily and wildly than the first. And its soul too seems full of secrets, and the hunger for treasure digging. That is how the waves live. That is how we live, we who will. I will say no more. So, you distrust me? You are angry with me, you beautiful monsters? Are you afraid I will divulge your entire secret? Well, be angry with me. Raise your dangerous green bodies as high as you can. Make a wall between me and the sun as you are now. Truly, at this moment, nothing remains of the world but green dusk and green thunderbolts. Carry on as you want, you high-spirited ones. Roar with delight and malice. Or dive again. Pour your emeralds into the deepest depths. Cast your endless white mane of foam and froth over them. Everything is fine with me, because everything suits you so well. And I love you so for everything. How could I betray you? For mark my words, I know you and your secret. I know your kind. After all, you and I are of one kind. After all, you and I have one secret. This aphorism is Nietzsche talking about drives. And I told you guys before when we were going through all like this theory of drives that Nietzsche's running, that Nietzsche thinks that's all that we are. We are drives. That's what we are. This is what Nietzsche's saying when he's saying like, I know your secret because your secret's my secret. We are the same thing. The waves, sorts of things, and the waves are like these drives. They're constantly, the picture I drew here is really this kind of model for how to understand the drives really fits perfectly with this metaphor that Nietzsche is using, because the the drives are always like pushing outward. They're always projecting out their influence. They're always looking to like articulate themselves and manifest themselves. And one of the big ways that they do this is through judgments, by throwing out this kind of, like, I call this like propaganda machine of claims that reinforce their nature. But the drive itself wants that. It's also hiding. It's not just advertising itself, it's hiding behind all of that stuff. Because the most powerful way that a drive could gain influence and power is by convincing us that it's not an option. Like when you think about your own actions as something like just influenced by a motive, as soon as you have that conscious recognition of it, then you're like, oh well, it's just a feeling I have. Like maybe I might not act in accordance with my feelings. Maybe that's optional here. I can be critical of my own feelings. We can have what philosophers call in some contemporary discussions second order desires. That is, desires about our desires. Once I recognize something as a desire, now it's an object that I can deploy a new attitude toward it. And now the drive itself might get co-opted by some other drives like story that it's like telling about how to understand this thing. Right? As soon as I think of this as an object, as soon as the drive becomes an object, it becomes vulnerable. That's the key thing here. So what the drive wants to do is not present itself like it's an option. It wants to present itself as if it's a necessity, that it's a basic condition of life, that it's a fundamental rule of the game here that is beyond question. That's how drives like to work in terms of exerting their power. And that's what Nietzsche's talking about here too, that when he's talking about how the waves, you're like, you're angry at me because I'm threatening to divulge your secret. And that's exactly what Nietzsche wants to do. In a certain way, he's saying, I'm going to do that. That's what I'm doing. Like, get all angry with me all you want. This is what I'm going to do. But at the same time, what the drives are afraid of, Nietzsche's like, you don't have to worry. Because what I want to do in becoming aware, like, remember this whole thing about humanity becoming honest with itself about how it really is a drive being, not a rational being. The sage is an illusion, all that kind of stuff. Nietzsche's saying we still want to build other ways of being that are like strong, powerful drives. They want to find better arrangements of drives that allow us to reach these kinds of higher levels of vitality and life affirmation. That's part of the project of the gay science. If we're going to experiment here, it's experimentation with drives and experimentation with life. How can we have more full life? And that's going to come down to what the drives have going on and how they're being arranged. And that's what Nietzsche's worried about with the weak people, is that the drives that they have keep them from being able to affirm life, the naysayers that he's talking about with that other aphorism. So that's some of the stuff that's going on here. The drives are always looking for objects with which to realize themselves. Like when I was talking about them before as they get food, they become stronger by feeding off of being given experiences to work with, to have experiences interpreted in their particular pattern, their idiosyncratic pattern, and then for them to be the thing that determines what actions should be done, what direction is going to be charted. That's what makes them stronger. So Lawrence is saying, so then in the same aspect that love is learned and becomes a drive, are all drives learned, or are those drives are there drives that are supposed to be innate? How would you differentiate between what is learned and what is innate? Well, Nietzsche thinks all of them are learned. The story he told, like, okay, so if we talk about, like, maybe I have some innate drives, and all we might mean by that Nietzsche would be cool with, would be like, I've inherited them. They are an inheritance from the society which has carried on this evolutionary path for so long. There might be some genetic things going on, but probably that's pretty minimal, I think, for Nietzsche. It's mostly about the social stuff and the conceptual technologies that humanity has developed that we become enculturated into. Um, that's our like inheritance of what would be innate, if anything is innate. Um, Remember when Nietzsche's talking about where the initial drives came from, the drives that are rooted in error? It comes from trial and error. Nietzsche says, at the beginning, the intellect produced all sorts of crazy ideas, and some of them caught on and enabled people who had those ideas to survive more readily, and other ones proved to be evolutionary failures because the people didn't survive. And so we pass on the knowledge from generation to generation of these ideas, but none of them were like fundamental to our nature. They were all created. There's just some that are more entrenched now because of how deep of a history they have and how much they've never really been called into question, or they've never been attacked where they stand. Nietzsche thinks, remember that like the Eleatics, the early truth seekers, they were attacking the errors, but not in a way that could be really powerful because it wasn't an alternative form of life that's really strong enough to go toe to toe with the paradigms that are this life preserving error stuff from time immemorial. Am I answering your question, Lawrence? Is this helping? Is this on point to what you're going for? Sweet. Did I kind of fully exhaust that, or do you got some leftover questions about it? It seems though that since all drives are learned, then with that knowledge they are all vulnerable. Um, that's right. But Nietzsche thinks their vulnerability only comes to light when we notice what's going on with them, when we're able to be kind of honest with ourselves about them. Um, because you can recognize any motivation and scrutinize it and its purpose. That's right. But here's kind of where things get really tricky. And this might go back to what you were worried about, Daniel, with the relativism stuff, too, and that Nietzsche may have dug himself into a trap here. Um, it is certainly possible that whatever method of evaluation that I scrutinize that drive with is really me just running some other drive program. Remember that Nietzsche thinks some of these fundamental instinctual drive errors are like really basic principles, like down to axioms of logic. Like Nietzsche thinks even that stuff might be erroneous. So, or rooted in these kinds of errors that we take for granted because of the drives that we have that run those as programs. Um, I think he's overreaching there, but there's still you can I think you can see this kind of concern that it's going to be really really hard to dig up the drives to the point that we can be really confident that we see things as they really are, that we see what's really going on here. I think Nietzsche's working really hard at that. I don't know how much hubris he has about his own efforts, or how much he would like. I think he'd still be cognizant of this kind of concern. Certainly, he accuses his opponents of it all the time. Like all of his philosophical opponents, he's like, "You guys just running these drives, man. Like that kind of philosophical argument is just evidence of a certain type of drive that you're using, that motive, and that's not a good motive. And here's some criticism for it." And this is where I'm always like, does Nietzsche hold himself up to his own standards of criticism here? Like Nietzsche doesn't become very vulnerable with us about all the time about the drives that he's running. You kind of have to piece it together from his readings or from his writings. But yeah, um, I would say if we're going to do this whole gay science project that Nietzsche wants us to, there would be a healthy concern about that kind of thing. The same way that we have when we do science. We're like, okay, here's some evidence. We interpret it as evidence for this kind of scientific view. What might be the assumptions we're taking for granted that enable us to make that kind of rational inference? Let's hold ourselves accountable to that as much as we can. I think Nietzsche could maybe do a similar thing there where we don't have to despair about the whole thing. And he would still be contributing something useful because he's saying the object that we should be putting more of our attention on is not the reasons, not the principles of the assumptions, but really the motives that are behind them. That's where we should go digging more than a kind of analytic approach to evaluation. Oh yeah, I should give you guys a code. Why don't I do that? It's all about the tries. Um, I guess I could just do that. I don't know. How about? Oh, okay. I want to do this one. Well, okay. In light of the always wanting to be a yes sayer, let's have the code. The code word tonight is dedication. And allow me to get a little sappy here. I told you guys this morning about how I don't want you to I want you to think of me as a resource that you've always got to draw on, regardless of whether you're in one of my classes or not. I don't think of my job as done when I submit final grades for you. I want to let you guys know that I am dedicated personally to your development and education and your interest and enthusiasm for philosophy or just life in general. I know that's not really always the expectation here for a teacher or an instructor, but that is what I am definitely want. I want to be a yes sayer to that sort of thing. So please, anytime in the future, and you just think of me as a resource that you can draw on. I've had lots of students come and get resource from me, get help for all sorts of and support for different reasons. Way past the point that they stop taking my classes, and I think that's a pretty cool thing. So I'm in your corner. Use me as a resource. So the code word tonight is dedication, in honor of that yes saying. So I wanted to share it with you guys again. Okay, so I promised to talk about the last aphorism, and Rob, sounds like you got some questions about it. Um, the most important parts of this aphorism are the ones that I kind of already talked about with you guys when we first looked at it. And this is one of the things that I think, if you don't like anything else in Nietzsche, this is still something that is kind of insightful observation that he has. This idea that there's so many different ways that we could be related to our conscience. There's so many different attitudes that we can have about morality and what meaning it has, what role does it play in our lives, and I think it's important to think about that rather than just being like, here's this standard that I'm going to be evaluated by. It matters what our attitude is in participating with morality, and even though I don't agree with Nietzsche's estimations about what are the appropriate attitudes, or what are the kinds of elements of morality that we should be engaging in, I definitely sympathize with him on this point of being cognizant of what is it that we're taking for granted about our kind of relational model to morality itself, almost like it was a person. Like, there's so many ways that human beings can be in relationship with each other, and not all of them are positive. They're not what we would talk about as like an ideal relationship. And I think that's the same thing with morality too. I also like the doubt that Nietzsche places on the conscience. I think that is a kind of interesting point, that we have to give an account here for moral intuition, about on what grounds it is justified, even if Nagel is right. That we can't just write off all of our intuitions as subject to these like evolutionary forces that constrained us in weird ways. Still, we should ask, where do our feelings come from? What's really informing them? Why do I have strong intuitions about this? Is that ground justifiable? What are the other ways that I might feel about this? And what could those other possible ways of feeling, what could they say about what we should think about morality? I think that's helpful stuff too. Um, so those are the things that I think are the biggest takeaways from that aphorism, Rob. Um, there's a lot of other content in there too. Is there anything that you would like to direct our attention to in particular? You were saying that you have some interpretations of it that you're not totally confident about, or you kind of want to double check on. And that goes for any of the rest of you in the chat too. If there's stuff there in that last aphorism. Are you saying, Rob, that there aren't any kind of leftover questions that you have? And I'm kind of looking through this too. There might be some other things I might want to say about it. Um, okay. Shoot the other questions in there too. I'd like to, and for anyone, if you guys got a last chance to dance here with Nietzsche, if you got some more questions, things you want to talk about with him, I'd love to do that. The very end part of this aphorism says, So I read part of it for you guys. We, however, want to become who we are, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. To that end, we must become the best students and discoverers of everything lawful and necessary in the world. We must become physicists in order to be creators in this sense, while hitherto all valuations and ideals have been built on ignorance of physics or in contradiction to it. I think he's being overblown here. But he's saying, so long live physics, and even more, long live what compels us to it, our honesty. And that, I think, is actually a very telling line here for Nietzsche. That when Nietzsche is concerned about uh, truth seeking, it's not like this purely intellectual thing of truth for truth's sake sort of stuff. I think it has to do with the drives that are connected with truth seeking, or that can be connected with truth seeking. The honesty stuff. I think that's what really is interesting to Nietzsche. The not lying to ourselves. That there's no need to lie. Like the universal yes saying, like being always being a yes sayer, being able to affirm everything is kind of like, if you're able to affirm everything, then you don't need to hide from anything. You don't need to tell yourself lies to like ignore certain things or avoid certain things, stuff like that. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing. Okay, here's another question. Can a weak person learn to be strong by Nietzsche's definition? Orthodox answer is no, cannot happen. And that's really how Nietzsche thinks about it. Uh, really, this becomes reinforced more and more in his later writings. It's a very strong theme in Zarathustra that weak people, the best that a weak person can hope for is that they will be, in some way, by being overcome in their weakness, they will be paving the way for something greater to happen. Not for them, but for something else, for the Übermensch to come along. That's like the most that we can offer as weak people, and we all are. We're all the weak people. I mean, I self-identify as a weak person. Boom, Nietzsche. I'm a weak person. Maybe I'm also a strong person. I don't know. The Lutheran in me gets kind of like excited about this because of the doctrine of simultaneously saint and sinner sort of thing. Like maybe I can be simultaneously weak and strong person, but just not on Nietzsche's terms. But yeah, Nietzsche is pretty harsh about this. Nothing weak people can do to make themselves strong. Sorry. He can be wrong about that. Personally, I think there's hope. I think that there's redemption. I think there's ways in which the poisonous aspects of our psyche and the drives that we run uh, that are no sayers to love. I think that those things can be healed personally. Um, so yeah. Can a strong person have areas of weakness? Yeah, in one sense, they're vulnerable to getting drawn into the game of slave morality. That's the biggest way in which strong people are weak, according to Nietzsche. Um, so that can happen. But the strong person, like the way that Nietzsche thinks about them, remember it's all about fundamental drives. So if you're fundamentally a strong person, then even your weaknesses are opportunities. You're like, yeah, I got some deficiencies. I can't do this as well as somebody else, but that's an opportunity for me to overcome and demonstrate my strength. So really, I think Nietzsche is going to say, whether you're measuring up or not, that's weak person thinking. Strong people thinking is like, what more can I do? Where can I go from here? What new challenges await? That's the strong person thinking. I think that, and I don't like Nietzsche's sort of divide of weak and strong people, but I think Nietzsche has, the way that he describes these things has some keys, some interesting morsels of insight, perhaps, for how we can understand paradigms of empowerment and paradigms of disempowerment, which is a big topic these days about like cultural issues of empowerment and disempowerment related to phenomenons of oppression, or the phenomenon of oppression, and what we can do about this to try to heal those things. Whether a way of looking at the world is a place of empowerment or whether it's disempowerment, that I think Nietzsche does have some useful things to say about. So strong, weak is for Nietzsche more like on and off switch rather than spectrum. Yes, because it comes from two fundamentally different types of attitudes that then spawn all the rest of it. Yeah, I think we were talking about this a little bit this morning in class. Um, yeah, for Nietzsche, it's all about the drives, right? What drive are you running? And the strength drive is the one that's eager to encounter paradigms of or situations of conflict and stuff like that, and to then challenge itself to become greater than it is, which it also believes to be its true version of itself. Rather than the maybe the weak person is the one that believes that they've got these limitations. There's nothing they can do about it, and then they're sad about it and disempowered. It's like it's about for Nietzsche, the adage that it's not about the behavior but about the attitude is definitely true. That's definitely how Nietzsche's looking at this stuff. All right. Anything else you guys want to throw out there? Thank you again for the people who showed up tonight. I mean, you guys have been really steadfast the whole quarter, and I really that's made this quarter such a better experience for me, and having to give these video lectures, and the content that you've contributed and the questions that you've asked have been very valuable, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I will. If there's nothing more, I'm gonna stop the video. Um, and yeah. Okay. See you guys on YouTube. Hope to see you on Wednesday. Hope to see you there. I highly recommend it. It's optional. It's optional. This Falk reading I think is pretty gosh darn cool, and also kind of connects some of our big themes about truth, more specifically with morality, and talking about the prospects of universal moral truth and whether we can use reason to discover what moral truth is. So pretty exciting stuff. I hope to see you there. But if not, good luck with the rest of the finals and have a great break. And I really hope to talk to more of you guys in the future. I was reflecting on that this morning. I'm like, there's some people in this class that I'm not sure I've said more than 2 words face to face with. So I hope that even those of you who I haven't had as much contact with, I mean, feel you're just as welcome as the people who talk to me every day uh, to like bother me and get in contact with me and talk to me. I hope for those kinds of opportunities too. So see you guys later.